Now, with the Civil War over with and with slavery abolished, Negroes had to find some way to make it out there on their own. And since they were unfamiliar with life as free people, it was relatively easy for others to take advantage of them. Labor agents were some of the people who did take advantage of Negroes by exaggerating promises and being unrealistic with some of the expectations that they presented to the Negroes. And we shall see some of these accounts as we continue in Dr. Leon Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Observe. Both during and after the war, several groups or freed slaves, largely women and children, were shipped to northern cities where they were placed under the supervision of various benevolent societies. But this never became a significant movement. The few who did come north in this fashion were usually employed in domestic jobs. Before the expected arrival of 100 Virginia blacks, a New York newspaper announced that applications were being accepted in the basement of Brooklyn's Methodist Episcopal Church for first-rate domestics, which were jobs like cleaning, cooking, child sitting, and so forth. These were the limited opportunities that were available for the few that did come to the North right after the Civil War. Most freedmen and freedwomen, however, if they even considered the possibility, rejected migration to the North as neither feasible nor desirable. They didn't want to go up north, which from one view may seem a bit odd, as you would expect that they would want to get as far away as possible from the people who had just enslaved them. But they had their reasons for remaining in the South, which made enough sense for them. Whatever the mammoth problems of transition they now faced, the ex-slaves seemed to suggest by their actions that following the North Star no longer constituted the only way to achieve their freedom. North Star meaning Northern USA and Canada. If the North seemed unattractive or impractical, Africa was even more so. Most of them weren't even thinking about Africa. Africa had been so far gone in the past at that point that there was no convincing the vast majority of them to move to this land where they had never been and where their ancestors had been captured and sold away from. So if the North was unattractive and it was on the same landmass that they were at already, then Africa was even more so unattractive. Although several prominent Northern blacks had maintained their commitment to African immigration through the first years of the war, few of them remained active in the movement after the Emancipation Proclamation. They gave it up because the vast majority of the people did not want to move there. A few did go, but the vast majority were not budging. Between 1866 and 1871, however, several thousand blacks, many of them from South Carolina, did accept the offer of the American Colonization Society for free transportation to Liberia. And that's perfectly fine. If they felt like it was something that they needed to do, then I support them completely for making the move. The explanation offered by a black colonizationist repeated the familiar argument.
We do not believe it possible, from the past history and from the present aspect of affairs, for our people to live in this country peaceably and educate and elevate their children to that degree which they desire.
But most of the black leaders in the North who had enunciated the same position only a few years back no longer thought it applicable, at least not until disillusionment with the overthrow of Reconstruction forced a few of them, like Henry McNeil Turner, to reassess the situation. With black interest in African immigration sharply reduced, and in part because of that fact, President Lincoln's scheme for removing the bulk of the freed slaves to Africa or Central America came to very little in the post-war years. Many whites were trying to get them to leave the U.S. because they really didn't want to deal with the huge social problem they knew was coming. So they tried to slide them out of the country after they used up their labor and destroyed their mind. But that didn't work out, and they became stuck at the hip with the Negro. And removing blacks to Africa and Central America came to very little in the post-war years.
They say that they have lived here all their days, and there were stringent laws made to keep them here.
A Virginian freedman explained to a congressional committee,
and that if they could live here contented as slaves, they can live here when free. If we can get lands here and can work and support ourselves, I do not see why we should go to any place that we do not want to go to.
Notice he didn't say go back or return to any place, because the vast majority of Negroes at that time were not from Africa like their ancestors were. They had never been to Africa and didn't know much of anything about it, so they couldn't return to a place that they had never been, right? That doesn't make any sense. That's why he said, why should we go to a place that we don't want to go? Nearly every post-war black convention repeated that same sentiment. For the post-war migrants, Mecca lay neither in the north nor across the seas but southward, where Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas vied for needed laborers by promising enormous wages and evoked images of opportunity and even lushness. And this is where the labor agents come in. And as with so many subsequent black migrations, the participants would find upon reaching their destinations that the attractions had been exaggerated and the shortcomings minimized.
I got to Texas and tried to work for white folks and try to farm.
A former Virginia slave recalled.
I couldn't make anything at any work. I made $5 a month for I don't know how many years after the war.
Here we go. The image of Texas as a land of milk and honey that had sustained so many involuntary wartime migrants gave way after the war to Florida as the land of plenty, where homesteads were plentiful, wages high, and laborers scarce. But the rewards proved to be far less than the promise, the homesteads less than plentiful and difficult to clear and sustain, and many of the disappointed freedmen had to settle for labor on the plantations. At the very least, the migrants who reached states like Florida, Arkansas, and Mississippi secured terms of labor that compared favorably to what they would have received had they remained in the older states. The Georgia planters, a northern traveler reported,
haggled at paying their freedmen $6 or $7 a month, while Arkansas and Mississippi men stood ready to give $12 and $15, and the expenses of the journey.
Throughout those older states, labor agents eagerly sought recruits and advertised the advantages of their respective regions. All he had to do to obtain laborers, a Mississippi planter boasted from Eufaula, Alabama, was to send his nibber to talk with the local freedmen. The white labor agents knew that some blacks could easily be bribed with money, so they used them in their strategy to get Negro laborers for the cheap.
They had nothing to do,
he said of the Alabama blacks, and he could easily outbid his Georgian competitors who offered only board and clothing. The planter left Eufaula the next day with 65 black recruits. Not all the labor recruiters were quite this successful. They were apt to encounter not only the hostility of local whites, but the suspicions of blacks who had heard tales of enticing offers that eventually resulted in sale to Cuba. Nevertheless, many freedmen listened eagerly to the promises of agents of their own race, accepted their assurances, and learned something about the biracial nature of deceit and betrayal. Meaning they learned they had to keep an eye out on both the blacks and the whites, who together betrayed and deceived other blacks. And this black and white duo in exploiting blacks, this is something that has continued all the way up to today, right? That's why you should not trust people just because they have a certain skin complexion, or you'll easily end up in these types of situations.
The white folks would pay niggas to lie to the rest of us niggas to get their farming done for nothing.
The whites would pay Negroes to lie to other blacks so they could work on the farm without pay. Now, why would the Negro do that to those that were supposed to be his own people? Because that's a character issue we're dealing with. His value system supported lying to them for money. He didn't care about doing that. And the whites who paid him were even worse because they initiated the scam. So the character of the Negro and the white man in this situation were similar, right? Which is why they were able to work together to exploit other Negroes. Observe.
He'd tell us, come on and go with me. A man wants a gang of niggas to do some work, and he pay you like money growing on trees. Well, we ain't had no money and ain't used to none, so we glad to hear that good news. We just up and bundle up and go with this lying nigga. They carried us by the droves to different parts of Alabama, Arkansas, and Missouri. After we got to these places, they put us all to work all right on them great big farms. We all light in and work like old horses, thinking now we making money and going to get some of it. But we never did get a cent. We never did get out of debt. All over was like that. Them lying caused all that. Yes, they did.
You see that? It was the lying N-word that caused all of this. But it wasn't just him. It was the white man, too, who paid the lying N-word to do this. So it was both of them. Reflecting on the exaggerated claims of labor agents, white and black, John F. Van Hook, who learned about their operations from his parents in North Carolina, tended to be more philosophical about the consequences.
Some of those labor agents were powerful smart about stretching the truth.
He recalled.
But those folks that believed them and left home found out that it's pretty much the same the world over, as far as folks and human nature is concerned.
Meaning humans have the same tendencies no matter where they are on the planet. Deception and self-interest are qualities that can be expressed by all humans. And the freedmen found out that exploitation and oppression followed them wherever they went. Despite the alarm they generated among whites, the numbers of ex-slaves who moved from state to state never reached the proportions suggested by contemporary accounts. The reports that blacks were leaving Georgia by thousands, that at least that many South Carolina freedmen were heading southward, and that Virginia had suffered massive losses, while essentially accurate in themselves, obscured the fact that most freed slaves, if they migrated at all, confined those movements within their respective states and counties. Most significantly, perhaps, they tended to seek out the counties where their people were already heavily concentrated, and to abandon the areas of white preponderance. That they settled where the demand for black labor was greatest only partially explains their preference. Equally important in some regions, racial violence and white hostility prompted ex-slaves to seek security in numbers, and that in turn drove them into the Black Belt counties, as in Alabama, and increasingly into the cities and towns, where, as many blacks thought, freedom was freer. Now, coming up, we're going to discuss how some blacks moved from the rural areas into the cities after the war, and also what happened as a result, so definitely stay tuned for that. But hopefully you have enjoyed this commentary. I thank you for your time and for your participation, and from here we continue to the next. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.